Isn't it wonderful to think about the world's endless mysteries? Some splendor which may inexplicably exist beyond conventional or even possible human understanding? It's a modern miracle of science that we can observe previously unthinkable interactions that shape the world around us. Though we haven't observed it all, obviously. So then, what are we to do with those gaps which still remain in our understanding? And taking a step back, actually, what even is science? If you, like me, were ever born at some point, you likely remember having to grow up. At different points in your life, you have been met with different people telling you different things to guide you on this developmental path. Who you are now is a culmination of these experiences and cultivated knowledge. But before you had the ability and skill set to acquire new knowledge on your own, it had to be supplemented. Some seemingly old and apparently wise figures likely imparted some of their own acquired knowledge onto you, whether they were official legal guardians or just people who were older than you at the time. These are people forwarding their knowledge onto those in need of it. Once you've reached a point where you can begin acquiring your own new knowledge, you also learn from peers who share with you the knowledge which has been impressed upon them. This is a loose explanation of scientific consensus, the way in which science is decided to actually be science, rather than unscientific. Science, then, is a tool and resource to call upon when making some decisions. When an idea is shared and agreed upon by a sizable majority, it is held as a guiding principle in which the majority then operates. Let's narrow down this example to get a clearer picture. In the case of a particular type of legal guardian, mothers specifically, the tendency in the United States is typically to defer to them as caretakers. As such, a sort of scientific motherhood persona develops in which they must have all the scientific knowledge related to the best possible care for children. They must build upon and use all the science that they have accepted as truthful and accurate to operate a proper household. It is certainly a harmful identity to become enveloped in. When the pressure of caring for a family is mostly on you, it will lead to long-term effects.
This health kick. Walk me through.
I have spent the past 6 years of my life thinking about being pregnant, getting pregnant, being postpartum, breastfeeding, really just focusing on like using my body for my kids, if that makes sense. There was almost this like time frame too in between pregnancies where I was like, oh, I don't really want to go balls to the wall and get my body fully back to feeling super strong because I know I'm going to get pregnant again and I'm going to have another C-section and I'm going to undo all that work almost. So I would still work out in between pregnancies and start to feel strong again. But in the back of my mind, it was always like don't commit too hard because we're going to go through it again. And now that I feel like we're done, it's just this feeling, this health kick is this feeling of like, I want to be the best parent I can possibly be.
So then, what about those gaps? Something that just so happens to be agreed upon to be science doesn't automatically make it accurate. What happens when something is agreed upon but actually wrong? A theory which is not refutable by any means is non-scientific. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. This was number 4 on a list of what Karl Popper considered to be the criteria for whether a theory is scientific or not. Essentially, science is something that must be able to be either proven or disproven through observations. Now, I won't say that I entirely agree with Popper's philosophy of science, but I want to introduce it as a baseline for how we can delineate the two, science and not science. It isn't as often as you think that science is what does the harm in this world. Usually, it's those gaps. When Karl Popper distinguished between science and what isn't, he made clear that, historically speaking, all, or very nearly all, scientific theories originate from myths, and that a myth may contain important anticipations of scientific theories. even if they themselves were not science. It doesn't end there though, now does it? As we know already, the science we have is called upon in our daily lives to aid in decision making, especially when we have gaps in our knowledge. The myths we have in our scientific gaps are themselves shaped by the science we do have. And this is a major reason why Popper, I feel, is too limited and constrained in his approach of what is or isn't science. This is also why mothers in the United States and similar countries are faced with such an unbearable task. Science has been agreed upon by the scientists that maternal nurturing is essential to child rearing. The population at large has taken that and induced that children must be cared for by mothers primarily. It's a simple line of rational logic, of course, but something is clearly missing already. What else is important and essential to childcare? All that's been said and observed in this simplified example is that maternal nurturing is essential, not that it is the only thing essential. Of course, the modern United States is not so similar to this dated perception of motherhood, and in fact, many fathers have greater roles in the household due to social cultural shifts. But what were those shifts exactly? What made it so that the scientific consensus changed and progressed in a way that allowed for those outside the scientific field to understand? Well, actually, in a very oversimplified explanation that I will dive deeper into, it was the fact that people outside the field were finally allowed in. That same study I just cited by Carlson highlights a major point. Women and families had begun to enter the workforce, as the men began encompassing a protector role to replace that of the provider. Now, this certainly doesn't point to one or another factor being the cause, and it isn't enough to infer such a conclusion by itself. Despite this observation, the study's focus was mainly on perceptions of identity and gun culture. The social factors it highlights as causing this cultural shift were industrial relocation and the globalized manufacturing trade, leading to mass layoffs. The reason why this single study holds such credibility and warrants attention is because it does what something scientific is supposed to. It builds upon past science. The focus on identity is the point of this study, but it certainly cites other research and studies that conclude what historical social processes occurred to likely create these new identities. It would be impossible to study anything new and make any sort of progress if everyone had to start from the beginning each and every time. But there is also the danger. Those gaps in science are filled with what is known already. But how can that knowledge be trusted if it's being built upon something assumed? This is why it is such a seismic shock when a major portion of the population suddenly enters a field dominated by a specific social class. To have an unprecedented re-examination from brand new perspectives allows for revolutionary progress. There is a great value in relying on data from prior research, but no one can ever encompass it all. And when a collaborative group still shares many of the same ways of thinking, it doesn't change all that much. This is the necessity of pluralistic, diverse community consensus in science. Different groups will try to learn from each other. They may adapt their views to some common aim, and so more unified ideologies may temporarily arise. But such ideologies will come from decisions in concrete and often unforeseeable situations. They will reflect the feelings, the aspirations, the dreams of those making the decisions. They cannot be foreseen by the abstract thoughts of a group of specialists. They will not only reflect what people want and what they are, they will also be more flexible, better adapted to particular problems. That was Paul Feyeraband, a philosopher of science who I hold in higher regard than Popper, if not without fault himself. Going back to Popper for a moment, that same year that Popper gave his lecture on science, 1953, a major discovery was heralded. DNA was a double helix. Maybe you know where this is going. Long story short, this famous image, dubbed Photo 51, was taken by then-student Raymond Gosling, under the instruction of researchers Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins. This photo would then go on to being pivotal into the research of James Watson and Francis Crick's official discovery that DNA was indeed a double helix. So the craziest thing just happened. In the process of making this video, just the other day, James Watson actually passed away. And you get to feel however you want to feel about that. Personally, I'm sitting here in front of an ofrenda for Dia de los Muertos. And I was just thinking, if next year James comes back to visit us as a spirit, I'd have a lot to say. Franklin would not receive any major recognition for her part, despite Wilkins's addition to Watson and Crick's Nobel Prize. At the time, the Nobel Prize had no rule against awards to those who died, and Wilkins shared the image to Watson and Crick without Franklin's permission. Again, this is a singular example of discrimination within the scientific community, and it wouldn't be so scientific of me to use it as a key piece of evidence. I want to simply point to the personal aspect of this, because instead of citing any study or review, I'm about to cite an entire book full of studies and analysis. When I do, I want you to just remember, these aren't just numbers. Very few ever get to be retroactively recognized like Rosalind Franklin, and even she died before ever experiencing it. It all started with a joke. It was 2011, and officials in the town of Karlskoga in Sweden were being hit with a gender equality initiative that meant they had to reevaluate all their policies through a gendered lens. As one after another of their policies were subjected to this harsh glare, one unfortunate official laughed that at least snow clearing was something the gender people would keep their noses out of. Unfortunately for him, his comment got the gender people thinking, is snow clearing sexist? Women are invariably more likely than men to walk and take public transport. In France, 2/3 of public transport passengers are women. In Philadelphia and Chicago in the US, the figure is 64% and 62% respectively. Meanwhile, men around the world are more likely to drive, and if a household owns a car, it is the men who dominate access to it. Men are most likely to have a fairly simple travel pattern, a twice-daily commute in and out of town. But women's travel patterns tend to be more complicated. Women do 75% of the world's unpaid care work, and this affects their travel needs. A typical female travel pattern involves, for example, dropping children off at school before going to work, taking an elderly relative to the doctor, and doing the grocery shopping on the way home. What all these differences meant back in Karlskoga was that the apparently gender-neutral snow clearing schedule was in fact not gender-neutral at all. So the town councilors switched the order of snow clearing to prioritize pedestrians and public transport users. What they didn't realize was that it would actually end up saving them money. Northern Sweden has been collecting data on hospital admission for injuries. Their databases are dominated by pedestrians, who are injured 3 times more often than motorists in slippery or icy conditions, and account for half the hospital time of all traffic-related injuries. And the majority of these pedestrians are women. All of that was in the first chapter, and I would say that is already a lot of empirical, quantitative data to support a scientific consensus that there is an issue in representation of perspectives causing structural harm to those marginalized. Women were being hospitalized at a significantly greater rate. That is structural violence, plain and simple. But wait. The data showing differences in experience for women was there already. Regardless, why wasn't it clear enough already for those in authoritative positions of power, even if they weren't women? The problem, as this highlights, is the limitation of statistics. The stories behind those numbers were lost on the homogeneous group of intellectuals and upper classes. It is through works like this book and the activism by intersectional movements made up of overlooked communities that the connections are laid bare. So what if the majority of pedestrians being hospitalized are women? Our society might just happen to have more women getting hit. It's not until you deconstruct the social dynamics at play influencing one another that you see it isn't just a coincidence, but a product of the way society is organized. Data cannot be observed in isolation, but in conjunction with observations made elsewhere by others. I can continue with countless other marginalized communities used as examples, but that does little to help and would end up painting a very different picture than what I intend. The point is not merely to grow discontent and disassociation from the sciences or its institutions, but to transform them entirely. Part of why I wish to emphasize the progressive aspects of science is because many are easily turned entirely apathetic and disregard any potential benefits from science as merely idyllic promises. Another philosopher of science, like those I referenced earlier, is Thomas Kuhn. Noticing the same tendency as I have laid out, he wrote, "Normal science, the activity in which most scientists inevitably spend almost all their time, is predicted on the assumption that the scientific community knows what the world is like." Taking this into account, Kuhn reasoned that scientific revolutions are not progressions of science, but completely resets based on new perspectives to base science on. He was not a complete pessimist on science, arguing that some implicit body of intertwined theoretical and methodological belief that permits selection, evaluation, and criticism would be able to interpret natural history. Rather, his main point was that eventually there will always be some transformation that radically reprograms our perspective on how the world works. This is a truly disengaging belief, as it promotes detachment, since the progress made at any point currently could just end up as obsolete when something shows how inaccurate it is. Far more extreme scientific apathy has been held by people with far more reach than Kuhn.
When I raised, and you said, well, if I show you the data, you'll change your, because I asked, will you unequivocally, without qualification, say that measles vaccine does not cause autism? And you said, if I show you the data.
I will publicly apologize
So here's a
and say that I was wrong.
Here's a meta-analysis from 2014, and you quoted Cochrane on several occasions, which for the people watching is a meta-analysis. A meta meaning they look at everything and then they come to a conclusion based upon as much facts as they can get. And here is such a study, and the title tells it all. Vaccines are not associated with autism, an evidence-based meta-analysis of case control and cohort studies, and they ended up looking at 5 cohort studies with roughly 1.2 million children. Now, this is from 2014, and it has a whole bunch of articles it references. In early in the President Trump's term, you and colleagues sent 90 papers for review by people at NIH. They felt like the NIH folks felt that without exception, they were severely lacking methodologically, and are found that they indeed showed the safety of these vaccines. Here is both older article, summarizing lots of older articles that have come out since the original refuted Wakefield article in The Lancet regarding measles and autism. So, back to me. I'm a doc, trying to understand. Convince me that you will become the public health advocate, but not just churn old information so that there's never a conclusion, as Senator Hassan suggested, but that will become the influencer for people to believe, no, there's 1.25 million kids studied and there's no autism associated with measles. You tell me, you see what my question is in there.
Senator, I'm going to be an advocate for strong science. You show me those scientific studies, and you and I can meet about it. And there are other studies as well, and I'd love to show those to you. There's a study that came out last week of 47,000 9-year-olds in the Medicaid system in Florida. I think a Louisiana scientist called Mawson that shows the opposite. So there are other studies out there. I just want to follow the science.
As you can see, if you truly believe in the repetitive overhaul of scientific consensus, then you can constantly argue that any published study contradicts a socially accepted study you don't support, despite any and all possible issues with the one you're citing. This is especially harmful if, let's say, you are the United States' highest scientific and medical authority, like the Secretary for Health and Human Services. At this point, one thing may be glaringly obvious to you, which I'll get to real soon. I've mentioned how gaps in the scientific understanding require certain cultural or mythic fillings, and why that can be extremely harmful in cases where perspectives are limited. But this is different. This isn't a gap in science. It's an outright denial. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. isn't assuming what may be true based on what we already know. He is rejecting what we already know and claiming that we haven't yet reached consensus. That is not science. It is quite literally in opposition to it.
Shows the opposite.
So then, why does he continue to claim that he is in favor of science and fighting against the very same behavior he is conducting? Well, the very same thing you've been screaming at me to say is stated just as clearly by Alexander Broadbent in his 2019 book. The spread of a medical tradition has at least as much to do with the political muscle behind it as its curative potency. This is about power. Kennedy might believe some or even most of his own rhetoric. It doesn't matter. What does matter is what he's actually doing, reshaping the entire federal scientific apparatus to fit his own paradigm of what science should be: health and wellness. Let's just focus on one example for simplicity and see whether there is any value in considering RFK Jr.'s perspective, or if it truly is unscientific. He's made many extraordinary claims that would require multiple hours to get into, so I'll just go with a recent one: beef tallow. On October 21st, 2024, good old Robert posted on his Twitter account that the switch from animal fats was made because saturated animal fats were thought to be unhealthy. But we have since discovered that seed oils are one of the driving causes of the obesity epidemic. This is not just some one-off comment he might have said out of context or anything. This is an official claim by the man who is now our official Health and Human Services Secretary. Maybe you've heard similar claims from elsewhere online, but the point is now that there is official support behind it rather than just some internet personality. So then, let's actually get into the science. Fats are structured, like most things, at the molecular level. When discussing obesity, it might be best to focus on short-chain fatty acids, which are essentially fatty acids with less than 6 carbon atoms. Okay, let me start from the bottom up. Atoms. We all know them, right? The fundamental building blocks of everything we know to exist, with everything being made out of some combination of them. But how exactly do they stick together? What keeps us from all just dissipating into the wind and all of our atoms floating away? Atoms, like everything else, have their own components to them. The difference is that they aren't just pieces put together like you'd think normally. You've probably heard of electrons and protons before, 2 essential parts of being an atom. But rather than thinking of them like Lego building blocks, you can think of them as forces, such as hunger or exhaustion. Even though we aren't physically built out of hunger or exhaustion, they certainly shape the way we are, compelling us to act in particular ways that do genuinely affect ourselves physically. Electrons are negative electricity, and protons are positive electricity. If you've ever played with magnets before, you can understand how these interactions work. Opposite electric charges attract, and similar electric charges repel one another. When an atom with a particular charge is close enough to another atom with the opposite charge, they will bond and form a molecule. Going back to fats, oils are specifically 3 fatty acid molecules in addition to 3 carbons. A fatty acid molecule is made up of a carbon bonded to an oxygen and a hydrogen on one end. Are you still with me? Once more, a fatty acid molecule is made up of a carbon bonded to an oxygen and a hydrogen on one end. And this fatty acid molecule, making up a fat, has 2 other fatty acid molecules in addition to 3 other carbons. This is why it's important to distinguish between short-chain fatty acids, which have less than 6 carbon atoms. The chain is the connection between the atoms, and it is a short chain because fatty acids usually have a lot more carbon. Still with me? This is a very simplified way of understanding why some fats from animals are able to hold solid form in room temperature, like butter, while plant-based fats aren't, such as oils. It all comes down to the chemical structure and the strength of the bonds between molecules. Liquids are fluid because the chemical structure isn't as rigid, and the molecules which are involved do not have bonds that hold them in place as securely. Gases are even more fluid for the same reason, and easily separated from itself. This is important to remember when considering how fatty acids build up inside a person, particularly the liver. They are bonding together in ways that hold themselves in a solid shape that then puts pressure on the body.
Obesity metagenomic studies showed that short-chain fatty acid pathways are activated, and short-chain fatty acid levels are increased in overweight or obese subjects and animal models.
If we were to operate with the same rational, inductive logic as those Karl Popper was criticizing, we might assume that this means that short-chain fatty acids are causing obesity, similarly to previous generations believing how women were the primary caretaker for children. But I'm sure you've heard the phrase, correlation does not equal causation. And since we're better than that, we can think of an alternative reason that they might be correlated. Perhaps, just maybe, short-chain fatty acids are activated in response to fatty acid buildup? Just a thought, which has been taken into account and observed. So,
The most important short-chain fatty acids are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Propionate, as a gluconeogenesis substrate, affects the central nervous system and protects the host against glucose intolerance and diet-induced obesity.
this might seem counterintuitive since it's still fat. Why would the body's protection against obesity be more fatty acids? Well, as we saw previously, these are unique fatty acids. These are short-chain fatty acids. Another substance found heavily in animal fats and oils is cholesterol, which you may have also heard of. This is an essential type of fat that all animals have, but which is also dangerous at elevated levels.
Colon microbiota produce secondary bile acids from cholesterol. Secondary bile acids serve as signaling molecules by binding to receptors such as the G protein-coupled bile acid receptor 1, the vitamin D receptor, and the farnesoid X receptor. The ability to metabolize the naturally occurring farnesoid X receptor antagonist, taro beta muricolic acid, is the basic process leading to obesity, steatosis, and impaired glucose, insulin, and leptin tolerance.
Thus, as we can see through publicly accessible, empirical, scientific data from peer-reviewed observations, fats from animals cause obesity from cholesterol intake when elevated beyond recommended levels. That is just one example, but a major one, considering cholesterol is such an essential component to our diet. Now, this only proves that animal-derived fats are able to cause obesity, not that they are causing obesity at greater levels than plant-based fats, which is what we need to show if we are going to disprove Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In actuality, some animal-based fats are healthy and effective at reducing obesity. Casein, a protein from milk, is stated as having
Most efficiently prevented weight gain and fat mass accumulation.
So no, it isn't all animal-based fats actually, but that's not what RFK Jr. said. He specified beef tallow, not just general animal products, but beef tallow in particular. Unfortunately for him,
Epidemiological studies also show that the consumption of dairy and vegetarian sources of protein is associated with protection against obesity, while a high consumption of meat, especially red meat, determines a more significant weight gain.
do I really need to go into further technical detail about saturated versus unsaturated fats, monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated? Does this not provide enough support for one side over another? This was not a study I was citing, but a massive literature review of studies published all the way from May 1974 to February 2023. I would think that the evidence is overwhelming. So any claim to the contrary is some mix of obliviousness and/or intentional contradiction. A culture can be simplified down as simply being a shared belief system. Those who operate with a similar understanding of the world, and therefore base their own behaviors off of what they perceive as appropriate interactions, are part of a shared culture. This is what makes scientific consensus so culturally esoteric and detached from the rest of society. When specialized vocabulary and assumptions are unique to a particular group, it excludes those who are not operating under the same understanding. Adding to everything else the level of condescension many practitioners in a particular field may have to outsiders, and you have cultural tension. People don't want to participate and actively avoid the sciences. We have already seen many examples of what happens when science has excluded portions of the population, and it is only exasperated by social dynamics. When Kennedy was appointed to the leading role in United States health, he was not able to get there by sheer luck. It was because many people genuinely wanted him there. Few of them were scientists, but many of them were voters. These are people who have felt betrayed, marginalized, and excluded by mainstream science and medicine, who saw their own wellness culture finally being adopted by a mainstream political figure. Healthcare is dead. Long live wellness.
Today we learned President Trump has picked Dr. Casey Means, a wellness influencer close to RFK Jr., as his new nominee for Surgeon General. It comes a day before President Trump's first pick for the job, Dr. Jeanette Nishwaite. Her Senate confirmation hearing was set to begin. Well, she's out, Means is in. She's a holistic medicine doctor who rose to prominence with the Make America Healthy Again movement and its ties to Kennedy's presidential campaign. She attended Stanford Medical School, but has shared a story of dropping out of her residency at age 30 when she became disillusioned with the healthcare system.
I'm going to dedicate that revenue to creating wellness farms, drug rehabilitation farms in rural areas all over this country. They're going to grow their own food, organic food, high quality food, because a lot of the behavioral issues are food related. A lot of the illnesses are food related. There won't be any cell phones there. There won't be any screens. We're going to reparent people, restore this connection to community. And I'm going to create these wellness farms where they can go to get off of illegal drugs, off of opiates, but also legal drugs, off of psychiatric drugs if they want to get off of SSRIs, to get off of benzos, to get off of Adderall, and to spend time, as much time as they need, 3 or 4 years if they need it, to learn to get reparented, to reconnect with communities, to understand how to talk to people.
Drug rehabilitation sounds really nice until you pick apart his argument. He's claiming that these wellness farms would help because most of the issues are food related. But we just disproved one of his major claims involving food. Do you trust this man's 3 to 4 year long drug rehabilitation program on a rural farm? I sure don't. Another thing I want to emphasize is that RFK Jr. is not the only figure to point at. The other clip was about Casey Means, a wellness influencer who Kennedy was able to bring aboard into the federal government, who is currently being nominated by the president as possible Surgeon General of the United States. If you've been on the internet for the past few years, you might already know a lot about wellness influencers and wellness culture. Unfortunately, now so does everyone. Wellness was born out of a desire for alternative medicine in response to authoritative and institutional medical models during countercultural resistance to established power. Regardless of where it began, we can see it's been co-opted by political figures as a tool to win over dissatisfied voters with an issue universally shared by Americans: anti-medical authority and resistance to big pharma, which are now mainstream political talking points. But when you compare the differences between someone like RFK Jr. and someone like Paul Farmer, who criticizes modern mainstream medicine, you see the key distinction. Governments can coordinate and integrate the efforts of diverse health providers to ensure that care is delivered efficiently and equitably throughout a given country. Without nationwide delivery strategies, private sector healthcare providers may cluster in wealthy urban areas and forfeit the economies of scale that come with collaboration and health system strengthening. Farmer has a solution there, but what's Kennedy's? This is how he answered a question about that: what people should be expecting to show that real change is coming.
What you are most excited about right now and what they can expect to see from a public policy perspective, a legislative perspective, to show that real change is coming.
Yeah. So President Trump named me as Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Yes. Congratulations, by the way.
The biggest agency of government. It's twice the size of the Pentagon. It's got a $1.9 trillion budget. Wow. And, the irony of that is we spend more on healthcare in this country than any other country in the world per capita, 2 to 3 times what most European countries spend. And yet we have the worst health of any country in the world. We have the highest chronic disease burden on earth. And that, as you know, bleeds over into infectious disease, which has been really... Infectious disease has been the focus of most federal expenditures in terms of research. Chronic disease is the destination of most federal expenditures in terms of healthcare. We have a sick care system in our country, and the etiology ultimately of all that disease is corruption. And it's the capture of these agencies by the industries they're supposed to regulate. Those industries, the pharmaceutical industry and the medical cartel, have transformed NIH, CDC, FDA, and ultimately CMS, which administers Medicaid and Medicare, into essentially sock puppets for the industry and profit centers. And they've commoditized the American public and turned us all into patients.
Yeah.
And,
profitable patients.
Yeah, it's been very profitable for them. When my uncle was president, I was a 10-year-old boy, and during that era, we spent zero on chronic disease at that time in history. There really were no cure. The first treatment for chronic disease was ironically, it was the pill.
Yeah.
It was the first time you took a pill, regularly.
Well, the first treatment for chronic disease was the pill. What pill?
Well, yeah, it was the first kind of long-term treatment that you took over a prolonged period of time. And when my uncle was president, we spent zero on chronic disease in this country.
Wow.
Today it's probably $1.6 or $7 trillion a year. It's about 90% of our healthcare budget. And we have the highest chronic disease burden of any country in the world.
You heard the same thing I did, right? He was asked about what to expect because he's literally the person in charge now. And he just didn't answer the question. All he could do was keep pointing at problems like corruption without ever providing a solution. He needs the problems to be the main focus because that's how he gets support. The moment he actually does anything worthwhile, he hurts his position. That's why he only does a little every so often. Once a month, you might hear that his CDC changed a vaccine recommendation, something his supporters have been waiting for. A little later, maybe he approved a generic contraceptive to appease pro-choice voters, he promised. But you know what he'll never do?
Because we're not going to drug our way out of the solution. We actually hear on the news, right, and from our elites, that the answer to our health problems is more access to drugs, is more
affordable healthcare.
And access for acute issues is a huge problem, and we absolutely should be. But no, it is a fundamental reframe of the incentives of healthcare. The problem with healthcare is not that not enough people are not getting enough drugs and not enough doctors. That's not the problem. Right? It's actually the definition of insanity, saying that the solution is more of a system that's hurting people. The problem is the fundamental incentive of every single healthcare institution. The incentive is they make money when people get sick. We need to change that incentive. The only way to do that is by, in my opinion, incentivizing and putting food at the center of health.
That is Callie Means, the brother of the possible Surgeon General Casey Means, and current special government employee, meaning that although his sister is not already in the government, he is, and he's been given status equal of other officials despite not being one himself. He is convincing you that better access to medication is what's harmful. He wants you restricted because that's better. Remember the earlier video of Kennedy talking about drug addiction?
But also legal drugs, often psychiatric drugs if they want to get off of SSRIs, to get off of benzos, to get off of Adderall.
He wasn't just talking about street drugs. He specifically listed different prescription drugs. He will never overhaul the system to transform it into something accessible, equitable, and scientific. He can't. Restricting access helps him seem like he's fighting back. Restricting access makes it seem like he's hurting the big pharmaceutical corporations. And maybe he is. But what's the point if all you do is tear everything down? What do you plan on building in its place? Whether he actually believes it or not doesn't really matter. Maybe he does genuinely believe himself to be a savior. He wouldn't be the first to have a savior complex that led to disaster. Now would he? What does take precedence is the effect he will have on the rest of society. The real harm that is to follow these changes. Because the harsh reality is, our society was never built to stop something like this. The institutions we relied on so heavily have always been esoteric and exclusive, even as they gradually begin including members of marginalized communities. To end this video, I want to play some clips of another YouTuber I admire from their videos.
I do personally consider it a moral imperative to address those historical inequities. But until we ask more than just who is allowed to do the work, STEM is gonna be kinda like the Supreme Court. Yes, there's a woman there. There are in fact a few women there. But is it good for women? I kind of don't think it does anymore. I really, really hope that people don't leave this video thinking I believe diversifying STEM is an unimportant endeavor. I know for a fact that some people will, but I guess I'm willing to take that risk because I sincerely think this framework of asking who is STEM for can be a lot more productive than just asking what are the demographics of STEM workers. For one, because the former includes the latter, right? If STEM is indeed for everyone in society, then it just makes sense to have a diverse workforce to cater to a diverse society. But this question opens up a whole slew of other questions about STEM that I think are important not just to the people who are excluded by it, but literally everyone. Or like, almost everyone. Almost certainly you. Why are so many Americans increasingly unable to access medical care despite us making all these advances in the treatment of diseases? Why is human space exploration led by guys whose factories are in such bad conditions that their workers are pissing in bottles? Why are all these platforms that claim to connect and educate us rotting our brains and undermining our democracies? There are more interesting questions we could be asking, more liberatory goals we could be striving towards, a more egalitarian and awesome future that we could be imagining. STEM being diverse is important, but let's not settle for crumbs. We deserve more than that. You deserve more than that. Unless you're these guys, then go f*** yourselves.
There are solutions to these problems. I stated earlier that I don't want this video to simply leave a depressed and apathetic impression onto you. We can rebuild and reshape our social cohesion to base itself on diverse perspectives and pluralistic, non-hierarchical structures. I have cited multiple people who have already posited ways to achieve that end goal, and I truly believe that we can collectively accomplish it instead of relying on the unconstructive criticisms from someone like RFK Jr.
Classical Chinese medicine was not religious, and it was naturalistic, but the masses saw ancestors, gods, karma, and sin as causes of disease and sought the help of a range of healers outside the learned tradition, as in the West. In the period 1911 to 1949, Republican China sought to establish a modern, westernized medical system, and after 1948, the communist regime took the healthcare system over largely unchanged, but started to incorporate Chinese medicine. Chinese and Western medicine came to enjoy equal status, with top physicians expected to know both.
The last thing I'll ask you is, what even is a physician? Someone who's learned and specialized in a particular set of knowledge? Are traditional healers not physicians then? You might argue that a physician must be scientific, but as I asked you in the beginning, what is science? I answered that science is a tool, but that isn't really enough. I've cited different people who I have varying levels of agreement towards, but now, in my own words, I'll say it clearly. Science is nothing without the people who partake in it. Science would not exist if we did not delineate certain things to be scientific. That much may be obvious already, but as pointed out by many before me, science is neutral. It isn't self-correcting like you'd want to believe, or inherently progressive like it should be. Science is exactly whatever the people who participate want it to be, which has allowed it to historically be regressive, discriminatory, and outright deadly. Science is much broader than a lab coat or an equation, and I push back on any notion that science should remain esoteric and specialized. I don't think absolutely any claim can be considered a scientific claim, but I do believe anybody can be a scientist, because science is broad. Science is a cultural creation, and altogether it is able to be reshaped, renegotiated, and recontextualized to fit new ways of thinking that adapt to new social cultural dynamics. Things do not completely overturn and ignore the past. They build upon what has been. That is why I disagree with thinkers like Thomas Kuhn and align closer to Paul Feyeraband. In the end, everyone partakes in aspects of what science is. Because we are science.